When I was a child, I knew better than to express any need to my narcissistic father. I don't know exactly how I knew not to express unhappiness or fears or needs about anything, but I knew it very clearly. Maybe I'd just been punished as a tiny child for expressing needs. Maybe it had just been his sharp tone in reply to me when I was very tiny. I don't remember. I have repressed the origins of exactly how I got the message. I just knew that I was never allowed to be unhappy about anything or to express that I had a need which needed to be filled. He was the sole judge of what I needed, and I wasn't allowed to express any need or desire that was not from him. In her influential book about parental child abuse called The Drama of the Gifted Child, psychologist Alice Miller imagines a hurting adult child asking his or her parent a difficult question. When I first read the book and read this question, I felt a bit sick at my stomach because I already knew the answer for my life. Here's what Miller imagines the victim asking the parent. What would have happened if I had appeared before you sad, needy, angry, furious? Where would your love have been then? And I was all these negative things as well. Does this mean it was not really me you loved, but only what I pretended to be, the well-behaved, reliable, empathic, understanding, and convenient child who in fact was never a child at all? What became of my childhood? From the beginning, I have been a little adult. Unquote. I know what would have happened if I had let my father see my needs, because I once allowed my unhappiness and fear to leak out. It was just one time, but that one time reinforced my understanding that I was to never express any need or fear or desire for reassurance. My father simply wouldn't allow it. And I knew that bad things would happen if I allowed him to see what my needs really were. But there was that one time when I was so scared and needed help so badly that I let him see how I felt. And things didn't go well for me. I had just started the 7th grade. We had moved to Pensacola, Florida, and I had started school at an inner city school which terrified me. We lived on Pensacola Beach, but the beach kids were bused into the inner city for school to some absolutely horrible schools. In every way that I can imagine, this new school was scary to me. I had been in great schools before. I was not accustomed to anything like this. Academic standards were non-existent. The cultural atmosphere was completely alien to me. But the scariest part for me was going down into the basement locker rooms for PE every day, where teachers pretty much allowed kids to get away with whatever they wanted, because the teachers didn't bother to go in there with us. I was one of only 2 white boys in the entire 7th grade at the school that year. I was treated like a strange and nerdy curiosity by these inner city kids whose culture was so alien to me. Every day in those dark locker rooms, I was threatened, verbally abused, and pushed around, literally. I was in fear for my safety, and the teachers didn't care. But I knew better than to think that it was something I should tell my father. I knew better than to tell him how unhappy and scared I was. This had been going on for weeks, and I was having trouble hiding how scared I was, even at home. One night when I had gone to bed, my father was still awake doing something quietly in the den. As I laid there in bed in the quiet house, feeling my fear of going back to school the next day, I started crying quietly. I remember being very conflicted. On one hand, I was afraid for my father to hear me. On the other hand, there was a part of my little brain that thought that maybe if he heard me, even though I was trying not to be heard, that maybe he would allow me to tell him what was going on. If that happened, maybe he would let me tell him how I felt. Maybe he would even do something about it. He did hear me sobbing quietly. He didn't come to see what was wrong, but he called out for me to come to him. He asked me what was wrong. In that brief moment, I felt an immense sense of relief. He had asked me the question so I could finally tell him the truth. He wouldn't hold me responsible for complaining because he had asked. I explained everything that had been going on. The words tumbled out and I was crying at the same time. Weeks of hurt and fear and torment came rushing out of my little heart. I told him how I was being threatened. I told him how scared I was. I told him everything. And then he started yelling at me. He was angry. He said that he was already under enough pressure with everything else that was going on in his life, situations which he had created in our lives, of course, and that I was being selfish to bring my problems to him. His face was red with rage as he yelled at me. I tried to tell him that he had asked me what was wrong, but that didn't matter to him. I was burdening him with my problems. I was being selfish for having a problem and for needing him. I was being a burden. Nothing else was ever said about my fears at that school. He simply ignored it. I went back to never expressing any needs. For the rest of my childhood, I was terrified of telling him that I needed anything. If the need were for money to pay for something or for something that was practical, it wasn't so bad. But I never again expressed any unhappiness or fear or emotional need of any kind to him. I learned a lesson which I've carried with me to this day. I learned that people don't want to hear about my needs. They want me to help them. If I have any needs, I should be humiliated. I should be afraid. And I should expect for anyone who sees my needs, especially my emotional needs, to push me away. As recently as 10 or 15 years ago, I probably couldn't have shared with you the feelings and thoughts which I routinely share in writing or online today. Those things were locked up because I was afraid of expressing them. I was afraid to let myself feel them, much less to allow others to know how deep my needs can be. But I've instinctively realized how much I needed to express these things. I knew that expressing my faults and failures was a defense against allowing myself to travel down the road of narcissism, which had destroyed my father. And being open about my fears and needs and other feelings has been a little bit like walking past a graveyard while trying not to be so scared. I can't go back and change the past, of course, but I've come to realize that I have to experience those old fears and needs. My body has retained the damage from repressing those things for so long, and it's taking me years to let that poison work its way out of me. It was when we lived in Pensacola that I first started my lifelong habit of taking walks by myself. Pensacola Beach is located on a long, narrow island called Santa Rosa Island. The side facing the Gulf of Mexico is the beach side, and the other side faces Santa Rosa Sound. It was along the Sound that I walked every day in the evening that year. I walked alone, sometimes for an hour or more. I walked because I needed to be away from home and to be alone to try to feel what was going on and to try to puzzle out what to do. My options were limited, but my 12-year-old brain had to at least think things through. For most of my life, I've been alone like that in one way or another. Sometimes in literal ways, even more often, though, in emotional ways. I've been traveling alone for far too long. And there are ways in which I am bitterly tired and lonely and afraid. I don't show that every day, of course, but it's always there. I know I'm not supposed to show it, but I desperately need to show it. I desperately need someone who I trust and love to come with me. I realize now that I'm not so different today than I was when I laid there in bed crying that night as a 7th grader. I wanted to be heard. I needed to be heard. I needed for someone to know what I felt. I needed for someone to love me and to help me. But at the same time, I was afraid, just as I'm sometimes still afraid about the truth today. The narcissists in our lives will sometimes tell us how much they love us. When they're in the right moods, they might tell us that they want to take care of us, and they might tell us how important we are to them. My father said those things at times too. But I knew from his actions that he didn't care. I knew he didn't pay attention to my fears or my needs. He just wanted to feel good about himself. His own needs were all he really cared about. For those of us who have learned to keep our needs to ourselves, it's hard to change. It's hard to accept that it's okay to have needs. But I'm not sure that we can have healthy and loving relationships with others unless we learn to accept our needs and learn to accept help when it's appropriate. Narcissists taught us that we're not supposed to have needs, but we have to learn to accept the truth that it's perfectly okay for us to have needs, and that if we find the right people to be in our lives, there will be others who care about our needs and fears. And if we learn enough and grow enough, there can come a day that we can express needs, and someone will be there who cares about us and loves us. And then we finally won't feel as though we're all alone in this world.